It was 2 a.m. when the pounding started. Not a polite knock, not the hesitant rap of a family member afraid to disturb, but the sharp, relentless thud of fists against wood. I sat up in bed, the humid Texas night clinging to my skin like a second blanket, my heart already knowing this was not good news. "Mom, open the door." Lillian's voice cut through the silence, high-pitched and impatient. "We need to talk now." I hesitated, gripping the edge of the quilt. My daughter's tone wasn't unfamiliar. I had heard it before, sharp, commanding, the sound of someone who had long stopped asking and started demanding. But never like this. Never at 2 a.m. in the very house I had built with Harold brick by brick. When I pulled the door open, the hallway light spilled into my bedroom, blinding me for a moment. There they were, Lillian, her face flushed with indignation, and Dominic, arms crossed over his chest, leaning against the frame like a sentry. In Lillian's hands, a stack of papers, their corners frayed and smudged, bills. She dropped them on the dresser with a slap. "We can't keep carrying you, Mom. Either you start paying rent like everyone else, or you get out." The words sliced through me like glass. Rent? In this house? The house Harold had worked his bones to build? The house I had paid off, receipt by receipt, year after year, after he was gone? For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. My chest rose and fell, but no words came. Dominic smirked, a look that said he was enjoying this more than he should. His silence was worse than her demand, like a verdict already passed. From the stairwell, a small voice broke the tension. "Grandma?" Mariah stood there, hair tousled from sleep, her little pajama pants bunched at the ankles. She rubbed her eyes, confused, her innocence caught in the crossfire of something she couldn't possibly understand. Lillian spun, her tone biting. "Go back to bed, Mariah. This is grown-up business." The child flinched. My heart cracked in that moment, not at the demand for rent, not even at Dominic's smirk, but at the way my granddaughter shrank from her mother's voice. This wasn't what Harold and I had imagined when we talked about this house carrying the family for generations. I whispered, more to myself than to them, "This is my home." Lillian's eyes hardened. "Not anymore. Either pay or leave. Tonight." Silence filled the room. For years I had known my daughter's hunger for more, her impatience with modest living, her restless eyes always darting toward what she didn't have. But never, not in my darkest imaginings, did I think it would come to this. Dominic shifted his weight, blocking the doorway just enough to remind me I had no allies here. And so I did what I had always done in the chaos of hospital wards. When lives hung by threads, I steadied my hands, quieted my breath, and chose calm over fire. I reached for the small overnight bag I kept for weekends at David's place, methodical, measured, a change of clothes, my toothbrush, and finally, the manila folder from the dresser, the one that had lived there for 2 decades, tucked beside Harold's old Navy watch. The folder that held the deed, tax receipts, and insurance papers. Proof, quiet and unassuming, that ownership wasn't written in their arrogance but in ink and law. I zipped the bag slowly. No yelling, no begging, no tears. If they wanted me gone, I would leave, but not as a broken woman. I would leave as someone carrying her weapon in silence. As I stepped past Dominic, his smirk widened as if victory had already been sealed. Lillian folded her arms, satisfied. They thought they had won. On the stairs, Mariah clutched the railing, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I bent down, brushing her cheek with the back of my hand. "Good night, baby," I whispered. "We'll talk soon." The night air hit me as I stepped outside, thick, damp, and yet strangely freeing. Behind me, the glow of the house seemed almost foreign. No longer the sanctuary Harold and I had poured our lives into, but a battlefield that had turned against me. Each step down the porch felt like thunder in my ears, echoing with the betrayal of blood. Yet in the small bag at my side I carried the truth. They could shove me out in the dark, but they had no idea what I held. I walked down Maplewood Avenue, the street eerily quiet, except for the cicadas buzzing in the distance. My breath came steady. Hospitals had taught me to hold steady, even when everything else broke apart. Tonight was no different. When I reached the curb, I paused, looking back one last time. Behind that front window I could almost see Harold's face, the quiet conviction he had carried when he said, "This house will carry us for generations." I whispered into the night, "It still will, Harold, just not the way they think." The night I left Maplewood Avenue, the humid air pressed heavy on my chest, but the weight I carried inside was heavier than anything the Texas summer could give me. It was tucked in the manila folder beneath my arm. Every page in that folder, tax receipts, insurance documents, the deed to the house, beat like a pulse, reminding me I had not lost everything. I had lost Harold once before, and that was a loss nothing could undo, but this house was different. That house was ours, and if I learned anything from Harold, it was that promises, once made, do not break. When I reached David's apartment and dropped down on his worn couch, the folder sat on the coffee table like a sentinel. I kept staring at it as though Harold himself might step out of those yellowed pages and say, "Mary, don't let them take what we built." And in the silence of that room, with the city humming faintly outside, my mind fell backward into memory. Houston had not always been kind. In the late 70s, the city was booming, concrete and steel stretching up, neighborhoods growing out of nothing. Harold had steady work in construction sunup to sundown, his back bent, sweat running into his eyes, calluses splitting on his hands. He wasn't a man of many words, but his conviction lived in every beam he lifted, every foundation he laid. We were just kids then, though we didn't feel like kids. Life was relentless. I was working double shifts as a nurse at Street, Luke's hospital, running from ward to ward, soothing newborns 1 hour and holding the hands of dying men the next. My shoes squeaked across linoleum floors until my knees ached, but every dollar I earned ended up in a coffee tin Harold kept in the kitchen. He would lift the lid, slip the bills inside, and murmur, "For the house." That house began as nothing more than a sketch on napkins. Harold drew it late at night, a modest 2-story brick home with a wide porch and a roof built to last. He always said roofs mattered most. "A roof keeps out the storm, Mary. Without it, you've got nothing." We didn't have much, but what we did have, we poured into that dream. The day Harold laid the first brick on Maplewood Avenue, I stood barefoot in the dirt and watched the sweat drip down his temples. He pressed the brick into place with both hands and leaned back to admire it like it was holy. "This house will carry us," he said, eyes shining in a way I rarely saw. "It'll carry our kids, maybe their kids too." I believed him, not because I thought bricks had magic, but because Harold's word did. It took years of patching together shifts, of saying no to vacations, of watching neighbors drive new cars while we held on to ours until the wheels rattled. Lillian was still young then, already restless, already tugging at the limits of our life. She wanted prettier dresses, newer shoes, things her friends at school had. She never understood why we couldn't just buy things the way other families did. David was different, quiet. He carried his hand-me-downs without complaint. But Harold never slowed down. Brick by brick, wall by wall, the house on Maplewood Avenue rose. When the day came to move in, the place wasn't glamorous. The air still smelled faintly of mortar, and the floors creaked under our steps, but it was ours. No landlord, no rent, just sweat turned into walls. I remember standing in the living room, Harold's arm resting heavy around my shoulders, while Lillian twirled in the open space and David pressed his hands against the glass window. "It's not perfect, Mary," Harold whispered, "but it's ours. And it'll stand long after I'm gone." I told him not to speak like that, but I knew he wasn't predicting death. He was promising permanence. The years passed, the children grew, bills never stopped. Sometimes the mortgage payment loomed so large I thought it might swallow us whole, but somehow we always scraped enough together. Harold worked until his back gave out, nights spent with heating pads and aspirin, but he never said it wasn't worth it. And then, too soon, he was gone. Losing Harold nearly broke me, not only because I loved him, but because the world grew heavier the moment his shoulders were no longer there to carry any of it. The mortgage did not pause for grief. The electric bill didn't bow its head at his funeral. So I did what I had always done. I went back to work. Double shifts. Endless nights. I walked into hospital rooms where life and death wrestled on the edge of a monitor, and I steadied hands that weren't mine. I told families their loved ones had passed, and then I came home to a house so quiet it made my ears ache. But I kept paying. Penny by penny, I chipped away at that mortgage. Until one day I walked into the bank and signed the final payment. My hands shook as the clerk slid the deed across the counter to me. She smiled, congratulated me, but she couldn't possibly know. That paper wasn't just ownership. It was Harold's voice whispering, "You did it, Mary. You kept the promise." I took it home, slid it into the manila folder, and placed Harold's Navy watch on top. If I had nothing else, I thought, I have this, and that's enough. Now, decades later, sitting on David's couch with the folder before me, I understood why I had grabbed it so quickly when Lillian ordered me out. Because somewhere deep down, I had always known this moment would come. Someone would try to take what wasn't theirs, and when they did, I'd need proof. Lillian never knew sacrifice. She was too busy chasing more, always fixated on what she didn't have. Dominic fed that hunger with his big talk, promising contracts and expansions that never materialized. He puffed himself up with words, but I had seen the cracks before David ever showed me. Mariah, though. She was different. She'd curl beside me in silence, content just to be near. No demands. No arrogance, just a quiet presence. In her hand, gripping mine, I sometimes felt Harold again, steady, unwavering. That night, as the memory of Harold's promise washed over me, I realized this was never only about a house, it was about legacy. It was about showing Mariah that her grandmother had not surrendered to greed, that what Harold and I built could not be erased by shouting in the middle of the night. I closed the folder and leaned back against David's couch. He sat across from me, jaw tight, fists clenched, but his eyes soft. "Ma," he said, voice low, "why didn't you fight back?" I let silence hang between us, let the weight of years fill the air. Finally, I whispered, "Because I was waiting for the right moment. Harold taught me to build slow, brick by brick, promise by promise. If they think they've won, let them, for now." David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "For now?" I nodded, resting my hand on the folder. This house wasn't just bricks. It was Harold's last promise, and promises don't break so easily. Outside, cicadas droned their endless song into the Houston night. Somewhere on Maplewood Avenue, my daughter slept under the roof she believed was hers. She had no idea the real owner sat here, waiting, holding proof that could turn her illusion to ash. And as I closed my eyes, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. How far will they go when they believe I have nothing left? The week after I left, Maplewood Avenue stretched out like a long road with no signs. David's apartment was small, the couch unforgiving on my back, but it was quiet. Quiet in a way that felt like mercy after months of tension. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator at night, the faint whistle of the wind through the gap in his kitchen window, and most of all, I could hear myself think. That was something I hadn't been able to do in my own house for a long time. But quiet has its limits. It also leaves space for memory, and memory doesn't always play kind. I thought about the kitchen where Harold once fixed the leaky faucet, about the laughter that once echoed through the dining room on Christmas mornings. I thought about the crack that had appeared above the living room window last spring, and how Dominic strutted around after fixing it, bragging as though he'd rebuilt the whole foundation. Cracks in the walls, cracks in the family, it was all starting to blur together. David tried to keep me grounded. He would come home from work, set down groceries, and watch me with the kind of quiet concern only a son could have. He wasn't one to waste words, but when he did speak, it cut clean. "You're not a burden here, Ma," he told me one evening as he slid a plate of fried chicken across the table. "Don't let their voices echo louder than mine." I smiled faintly, grateful, but I didn't say what I was thinking, that sometimes children's voices never leave you, no matter how cruel they become. Lillian's tone, sharp and entitled, replayed in my mind like a bad song on repeat. 2 nights later, David came home to find me sitting with the folder open on his table. The deed spread out, Harold's watch beside it, the old tax receipts in neat stacks. He set down his keys and frowned. "Why do you keep looking at it?" "Because it reminds me, I'm not crazy," I said simply. "It reminds me I still own something, even if they think otherwise." He sat across from me, elbows braced on the table, eyes narrowing. "They don't think, Ma. They assume. They take. Lillian's been like that since she was a kid, you just never wanted to see it." I winced, because he was right. A mother doesn't want to admit her child has rot growing inside. You tell yourself it's ambition, drive, personality. You cover the cracks with excuses. But cracks have a way of widening until they're impossible to ignore. That weekend, David insisted on driving me back to Maplewood to pick up a few things. "You can't keep living out of one bag," he argued. I didn't want to go, but part of me needed to see it, to face the house again, to see what it looked like with me gone. The street was the same. The oak trees lining Maplewood swayed in the humid air, and the neighbors' houses sat with their blinds drawn, oblivious to the war that had erupted inside one particular set of brick walls. When we pulled into the driveway, my chest tightened. Dominic's truck sat there like a sentinel, too big for the space, too loud for the neighborhood. I stepped onto the porch with David beside me. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Lillian stood there, arms crossed, her expression icy. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. David straightened, his voice low but firm. "She came to get her things. That's still allowed, isn't it?" Lillian's eyes flicked to me, and for a second I thought I saw guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She stepped aside reluctantly, and I walked in. The house smelled different. Grease, cheap cologne, and something sour lingered in the air. Our living room looked cluttered, full of things that weren't mine. A new rug I hadn't bought. A lamp I hadn't chosen. It felt like someone else's home, a stranger's. I moved through the kitchen quietly, gathering a few dishes, some framed photos, the sweater Harold had given me on our last Christmas together. David hovered near me, but his eyes scanned everything, sharp and watchful. Dominic appeared from the hallway, his smirk in place. "Well, look who decided to visit. You forgot to pay this month's rent," he sneered. I froze, my hands tightening on the photo frame. David stepped forward before I could speak. "Rent? Are you out of your damn mind? This is her house, Dominic. Hers." Dominic laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "Not anymore." She walked out. She left it to us. The air crackled. I could see David's fists clench, the soldier in him ready to rise. I placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "Not here," I whispered. "Not now." We gathered what we needed and left without another word, though Dominic's voice followed us out the door, taunting. "Don't bother coming back. You're not welcome here." Back in the car, David slammed the steering wheel with his palm. "They're out of control, Ma. You can't just sit by and let this happen." "I'm not," I said quietly, the folder resting on my lap. "I'm waiting." David looked at me sharply, but he didn't push. He knew me well enough to understand that when I said I was waiting, it wasn't out of weakness. It was strategy. Days passed. I settled into David's routine, but Maplewood never left my mind. Mariah began showing up quietly, knocking on David's door after school with her backpack slung over her shoulder. She'd slip inside, offering little gifts, chips, juice boxes, drawings. One evening, she placed a worn teddy bear in my lap. "So you won't be lonely," she whispered. I hugged her, fighting the sting in my eyes. That child carried more truth than her parents ever could. She told me about the late-night arguments, about her mother slamming doors, about her father cursing when bills arrived in the mail. She leaned close one night and said, "Grandma, they talk like the house is theirs, but I know it's yours." Her words lodged in my chest like a blade, sharp but cleansing. Children see what adults try to hide. Mariah saw everything. It was on one of those visits that David finally pressed me harder. We sat at the kitchen table, Mariah scribbling quietly on a piece of paper beside us. David leaned in. "Ma, I can't stand watching this. Why are you letting them live in your house, treating you like a tenant, while you sit here?" "Because," I answered slowly, "sometimes silence is the only way to let people reveal who they really are." David shook his head, frustrated. "Silence won't stop them from stealing, Ma." I placed my hand on the folder. "No, but it will stop me from losing myself." The next Saturday, David came home with a grim look on his face. He dropped a stack of papers on the table, credit reports, loan notices. "I had a buddy check into Dominic," he said. "He's drowning, Ma. 2 trucks already flagged for repossession. Loans unpaid, and Lillian," he hesitated. "She used your old bank documents months ago, forged your signature for a loan. It defaulted." The room tilted slightly. Forgery, my own daughter. I felt the blood drain from my face. "They're desperate," David continued. "That's why they're pushing you for rent. They're sinking, and they want to drag you down with them." Mariah looked up from her drawings, her little brow furrowed. "Is Mama in trouble?" I reached over, smoothing her hair. "Not you, baby. None of this is your fault." That night, after David tucked Mariah into the spare room, I sat alone at the table with Harold's watch in my hand. The tick was faint now, worn from years, but I swore I could still hear it. Harold's voice echoed in my mind. "This house will carry us." I whispered back, "It will, Harold, just not the way they think." The cracks in the family were no longer subtle lines. They were wide enough to see straight through. Lillian and Dominic believed they were winning, believed they had forced me into silence. But what they didn't know was that silence is not surrender. And as I sat there in the dim light, staring at the folder, one question pressed against me like a shadow I couldn't shake. When the time comes, how loud will the truth sound when it finally breaks their illusion? The papers David laid on the kitchen table stayed with me through the night. I couldn't shake the weight of them. My daughter had forged my signature. My son-in-law was drowning in debt. And here they were, acting like royalty in the house Harold and I had bled to build. For years I had chosen peace over confrontation, telling myself silence was strength, telling myself Harold would have wanted me to avoid fights. But sometimes silence isn't about avoiding battle. Sometimes it's about sharpening your blade. I didn't tell David right away, but that night I made up my mind. I would not scream. I would not argue. I would not throw myself into the mud with them. Instead, I would move with precision. Hospitals had taught me that timing is everything. A late intervention can kill as quickly as no intervention at all. The same was true for family wars. You wait, you breathe. And then, when the moment is right, you act. The next morning, I rose early, dressed in my plain gray blouse, and smoothed my hair back as if preparing for a shift I no longer worked. David was at the stove making coffee when I sat down. "Ma, you didn't sleep," he said, glancing at my face. "No," I admitted, wrapping my hands around the cup. "I've made a decision." He raised his eyebrows. "What kind?" "I'm going to sell the house." His spoon froze mid-stir. "Sell it?" "Yes," I said, steadying my voice. "Not to them, not to anyone who'd squander it. I'll sell it on my terms, and when it's gone, they'll be left with nothing but their arrogance." David stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "If that's the road you want, I'll stand with you." I reached for the manila folder, running my hand over the crisp edge of the deed. Harold built that house with his bare hands. I carried the mortgage after he was gone. We did not bleed for it to become a throne for thieves. If I sell it, I take back the story. I decide how it ends. David leaned back, letting out a long breath. "Then we'll need someone sharp. Not just any realtor. Someone who can move fast." I already knew who. Years ago at church, a woman had spoken to me about her work, Karen Grant. She wasn't flashy, but people said she was relentless. She had a way of turning even the most modest properties into gold. I remembered her because she reminded me of the nurses I used to work with. Brisk, efficient, unsentimental, but always getting the job done. That afternoon I dialed her number. When she picked up, her voice was brisk but warm. "Mrs. Grant speaking." "This is Mary Bishop," I said quietly. "I don't know if you remember me. We met once at Street Luke's through the Peterson family." There was a pause, then a hum of recognition. "Yes, I do remember. What can I do for you?" "I want to sell my house on Maplewood Avenue." Her tone sharpened immediately. "That neighborhood has been booming. If your property is in good shape, Mrs. Bishop, you might be surprised at the offers you'll get." My chest tightened. "Can you come take a look?" 2 days later, she was standing in the living room of the house I had been exiled from, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning every corner. David stood by me like a sentinel, arms folded, jaw set. I had insisted we meet there while Lillian and Dominic were out. The house was technically still mine, and I had every right to bring a realtor through, but even so, I moved through the rooms quietly, as though the walls themselves might betray me. Karen was thorough. She tapped the banister, ran her fingers over the brickwork, checked the light in each room. She scribbled numbers on her pad, murmuring to herself. When she finally sat at the dining table, sunlight spilling through the window, she looked up at me and smiled. "Mrs. Bishop, you're sitting on a fortune. I could have buyers lined up within a week. This market is hot. You could easily fetch $850,000. The number hit me like a bell ringing through my chest. $850,000. For the house they tried to push me out of in the middle of the night. For the house Harold had promised would carry us. It wasn't just money, it was justice written in zeros. I nodded slowly, folding my hands to keep them steady. Do it. David exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. Karen tapped her pen against the pad. I'll draft the paperwork. Once you sign, we'll move fast, quietly if you prefer. Quietly, I said. No one needs to know until it's done. Over the next few days, I lived in silence while Karen worked her networks. Lillian and Dominic strutted around Maplewood Avenue as if they were kings, while I knew the ground was already shifting beneath their feet. They threw parties, filled the house with noise, invited friends into rooms Harold had built with sweat. I stayed away, but Mariah came to me with wide eyes, telling me about the shouting matches, the unopened envelopes piling on the counter, the way her parents' voices grew sharper by the day. She leaned close one evening, whispering, "Grandma, they think they're in control, but they're not, are they?" I kissed her forehead and whispered back, "Truth always finds its way." On the 5th day, Karen called. "I have an offer, full asking price, $850,000. They're serious buyers." I sat at David's kitchen table, the phone pressed to my ear, Harold's watch in my other hand. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since that night at 2 a.m, I felt the weight lift. Not completely, but enough to breathe. "Accept it," I said. That night, I laid the acceptance papers beside Harold's watch and the deed. 3 items, small and unassuming, yet together they were an arsenal. Past, present, and future. I imagined Lillian's face when the truth arrived. I imagined Dominic's smirk collapsing, and I did not feel guilt. I felt steady. When Karen brought the paperwork for my signature, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. I signed slowly, deliberately, each stroke of my pen a strike against the arrogance that had filled my house. David stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder, grounding me. When I set the pen down, Karen smiled. "Congratulations, Mrs. Bishop, you just secured your freedom." But freedom isn't the same as peace. Peace would only come when the truth confronted them, when the illusion they clung to shattered in broad daylight. For now, I waited, the secret burning steady in my chest. That evening, Mariah slipped into David's apartment with her backpack. She sat beside me, her eyes bright. "Grandma," she whispered, "Mama says the house is hers now. She says you left it." I looked at her carefully. "And what do you think?" Her little chin lifted with quiet defiance. "I think she's wrong." I smiled, pulling her close. "Then you already know more than most grown-ups." David came in then, tossing his keys on the counter. He studied us for a moment, then asked, "When are you going to tell them?" "Not yet," I said, my voice calm. "Let them walk around a little longer thinking they've won. The silence will make the fall sharper." For the next few days, I held on to that silence like a weapon. I carried groceries with David, folded laundry, listened to the hum of his refrigerator at night, and all the while I knew the house was no longer mine but no longer theirs either. It belonged to a new family now, a young couple ready to fill it with laughter. Maplewood Avenue had been torn from me, but in giving it up, I had taken everything from the ones who had betrayed me. Still, the question pressed at me every night as I lay on David's couch, Harold's watch ticking faintly on the table beside me. When the truth comes, how will they react? Will they scream, beg? Or will the silence swallow them the way it once swallowed me? And in that question lay the next step. It wasn't enough to sell. It wasn't enough to sign. The reckoning hadn't arrived yet. That moment still waited on the horizon, steady as a storm cloud gathering in the distance. Resolution came in the form of clarity. The paperwork was signed, the money would clear, the house was no longer theirs to claim. Transition came in the form of inevitability. Sooner or later, I would have to walk back up those porch steps and face them, not with anger, not with fists, but with the quietest weapon of all, a signature that had already sealed their fate. And so the question burned in me, sharp and relentless, as I folded the papers back into the folder and placed Harold's watch on top. When the door finally opens, and they learn the truth, will they see me as powerless, or will they finally understand whose name was always written on the deed? The papers were signed, the deal set in motion, and yet I carried on as though nothing had changed. Silence became my shield, my disguise. Lillian and Dominic strutted through Maplewood Avenue, hosting barbecues on the back patio Harold had laid brick by brick, while I lay on David's couch holding a secret that was sharper than any blade. They thought they had stripped me of power, but what they didn't know was that I had already taken everything from them with the stroke of a pen. David wanted me to confront them immediately. "End it, Ma," he said one night, pacing our small kitchen. "Show them the papers. Make them pack up before the sheriff even comes." His voice carried the soldier's hunger for direct battle. But I shook my head. "Not yet. If I show them now, they'll scramble. They'll fight. I want them steady in their illusion. I want them to believe they've won right up until the moment the ground disappears beneath them." David muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue further. He was beginning to understand that patience was not weakness, it was strategy. Mariah continued to sneak over, slipping into David's apartment with little gifts. She carried her school books, curled up beside me on the couch, whispering secrets she didn't even realize were weapons. "Daddy's mad all the time," she confided one afternoon. "He yells about money. He says the trucks are going away." I asked softly, "Trucks?" She nodded, her big eyes serious. "The ones for his business. He said the bank is taking them back. Mama tells him to stop worrying, but then she cries in the bathroom. Children notice everything." While Dominic played the part of the arrogant provider, his empire was rotting from the inside. Each repossessed truck, each overdue notice was another crack in the foundation of his lies. David confirmed it days later when he came home with a folder of his own. He dropped it on the table, his jaw set. I asked around again. "He's finished, Ma. 2 trucks repossessed already, a 3rd flagged. He owes more than he can pay in 3 lifetimes. And Lillian," he hesitated, then opened the folder. "She forged your name on a loan. I had it checked. It's confirmed." I sat very still, my chest tight. I had known it, deep down, but seeing it in black and white was another wound. My daughter, my own blood, had stolen my name, my history, my trust. David's voice softened. "They're not strong, Ma. They're desperate. That's why they're treating you like a tenant. You're their lifeboat, and they're trying to keep themselves afloat by sinking you." I closed my eyes, Harold's watch ticking faintly against my palm. Desperation explains cruelty, but it doesn't excuse it, and the cruelty they had shown me would not go unanswered. While I held my silence, their desperation grew louder. Neighbors called David, telling him about shouting that carried into the street, about Dominic storming out late at night, about Lillian pacing with her phone glued to her ear. They pretended at confidence, but their house of cards was tilting. Mariah, sweet child, became my bridge back to Maplewood. She whispered of unopened envelopes stacked on the counter, of calls that made her parents' faces go pale. She confided that sometimes she pretended to sleep just so she wouldn't hear them argue. "Grandma," she whispered one night, her voice trembling, "why don't you just tell them it's your house?" I pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Because, baby, sometimes you let people walk right into the trap they built for themselves. They'll see soon enough." Inside me, the fire of resolution grew steadier. I wasn't rushing toward vengeance, but preparing for justice. Harold's voice seemed to echo in the stillness. "Brick by brick, Mary. Build it right." The real estate process moved quickly. Karen Grant worked like a storm, fielding calls, reviewing offers, handling inspections. She never let the momentum falter. When she called me with the final confirmation, her voice was almost triumphant. "Mrs. Bishop, the sale is complete. The Jeffersons have wired the money. The house is theirs. Legally, Maplewood Avenue no longer belongs to you, and it never belonged to anyone else either." The money cleared into my account within days, $850,000, a number that meant not just security but freedom. David sat with me at his kitchen table, going through every page of the transfer, his eyes sharp but proud. "Ma, you've done it. You've taken back everything." I shook my head gently. "Not everything, not yet, they don't know, and until they do, it isn't finished." David frowned. "You want to face them?" "I need to," I said simply. "I need to stand in that house one last time and let them see the truth with their own eyes." He hesitated, then nodded. "Then I'll stand with you." The day of reckoning drew closer like a storm cloud. I lived quietly, folding laundry, listening to Mariah's laughter, pretending life was ordinary. But under it all, my secret burned steady. Then one evening, Mariah arrived in tears. She clung to me, trembling. "Grandma," she whispered. "Mama said if you come back, she'll call the police. She said you don't belong there anymore." The cruelty of it sliced through me like a knife. My own daughter, threatening to call the law on me in the house built by my husband's sweat and my sacrifices. I smoothed Mariah's hair, steadying myself. Don't you worry, baby. The law's already on my side. That night, as I lay on David's couch, I thought about Harold. I imagined him standing on the porch of Maplewood Avenue, wiping sweat from his brow, his voice steady. This house will carry us. He never meant it would carry us without storms. He meant it would carry us through them. Now, the storm was nearly at its peak. Resolution of this chapter came as clarity. The house was sold, the money secured, the legalities sealed. Transition came as inevitability. Soon, very soon, I would walk back into that house, not as a victim, but as the rightful owner closing her final chapter. And yet, as I closed my eyes, one thought gnawed at me. What will Lillian do when the truth arrives at her doorstep, not whispered, not threatened, but written in the ink of law? The heat had already risen by 8 in the morning, that kind of suffocating Texas heat that makes the air feel like soup. Houston was alive with the noise of cicadas buzzing in the oak trees along Maplewood Avenue, their song like a steady drumbeat in the background of a day I had long seen coming. I wore a simple skirt and a pale blouse, ironed the night before, not out of vanity, but out of ritual. If I was going to walk back into the house where I had been humiliated, I would not return looking broken. David drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw locked in a line I recognized from the battlefield of his youth. He was always a man of control, but that morning even he couldn't hide the simmer beneath his skin. I glanced at him, wanting to calm him, but my own silence was the steadier anchor. I had lived too long not to know the power of waiting for the right moment. The house came into view suddenly, like a wound reopening. The bricks, the porch, the roof Harold once said would keep storms at bay. It all stood just as it had, but my heart saw it differently now. Not as a sanctuary, not as a cage, but as a monument, ready to be passed on. David parked at the curb. We didn't get out immediately. I sat there, the air thick between us, staring at the house where decades of memories, good and bad, had been stitched into the walls. Finally, I whispered, "Harold, it's time." Another car pulled up behind us, sleek and silver. Karen Grant emerged first, her heels clicking against the pavement, her expression sharp, every inch the professional who handled fragile matters without flinching. Behind her, the Jeffersons climbed out, a couple in their 30s, both neatly dressed, holding hands. Their eyes carried both excitement and hesitation. They looked like people stepping onto the first page of their own story, ready to pour laughter and tears into new walls. Karen approached, offering me a firm nod. "Morning, Mrs. Bishop. Are you prepared?" I inhaled deeply, the air thick with humidity. "I've been preparing for this since the night they put me out." She studied me a moment, then smiled faintly. "Good. Let's get to it." The 5 of us walked toward the porch together. My steps slowed as I mounted those familiar stairs. I thought of Harold, wiping sweat from his brow as he hammered nails into that very frame. I thought of Mariah's chalk drawings on the steps, the laughter that once echoed on summer afternoons. My chest tightened, but I straightened my back. This wasn't nostalgia. This was justice. The door swung open before we knocked. Lillian filled the doorway, her face pale but cold. She had her arms crossed in that way she always did when she wanted to look strong, though I knew her tells. Her lips pressed too tight, her eyes flickering nervously. It was bravado dressed as strength. Behind her, Dominic loomed, his smirk coiled in place like a mask he refused to remove. His voice came out first, sharp. "What the hell is this? What are you doing here?" Karen's tone was calm, clipped. "We're here to finalize access for the new owners." The words seemed to slice the air. Lillian blinked, confusion giving way to shock. "New owners? What do you mean?" I stepped forward, my voice steady as stone. "The house has been sold, Lillian. It's no longer mine, and it was never yours." Dominic's laugh was harsh, strained. "You can't do that. You can't just sell the house without telling us." Karen pulled out her folder, flipping briskly. "Actually, she can, and she did. All legal documents are complete. The Jeffersons are now the rightful owners of this property." The Jeffersons shifted awkwardly, nodding politely, as though their presence itself was an apology. Their politeness only made the blow sharper. Lillian's jaw dropped, her voice cracking. "You mama, you wouldn't do this to us. Where are we supposed to go?" I held her gaze, unflinching. "You told me to pay rent or leave. At 2 in the morning. Do you remember?" Now it's you who must go. But not by my order, by the law. Dominic's face turned crimson. He stepped forward, his chest puffing up. We've been living here. This is our home. David moved between us instantly, his presence large, his voice low and cutting. No, Dominic. You've been squatting in what was never yours. And now you're about to learn the difference between living somewhere and owning it. Dominic opened his mouth to argue, but Karen cut him off, her voice brisk, professional, merciless. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. After that, the sheriff will be notified to remove you. Here's the official notice. She placed the paper in his hand like a verdict. Lillian sank onto a chair by the doorway, her hands trembling as she stared at the document. For the first time, she looked small. Not fierce, not powerful, just small. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. Mama, please, don't do this. We'll have nowhere. The plea might once have pierced me. Years ago, I might have softened, remembered her as the child I once rocked to sleep. But now, after betrayal layered on betrayal, after being cast out like a tenant in my own house, mercy had taken another form. Mercy was not letting them continue. Mercy was ending the lie. You'll figure it out, I said simply, my voice calm. You always do when you want something badly enough. Behind them, from the staircase, a soft voice broke the tension. Grandma? Mariah stood there in her pajamas, hair tousled, clutching the railing. Her eyes were wide, confusion written across her face. I softened for her, lifting a hand. It's all right, baby, the truth has come. Her gaze met mine, steady in its innocence, and I felt Harold's presence in her more than in any brick or beam of that house. The Jeffersons stepped forward then, their politeness wrapped in nervousness. We'll be moving in this weekend, the husband said gently. We'll give you time to collect your things, but as of today, this house belongs to us. The words were final, unshakable. Dominic muttered curses, pacing like a caged animal, his pride collapsing piece by piece. Lillian's tears slid silently down her cheeks, and for once, she didn't have words. I turned toward the door, David steady beside me. The air outside was hot, but it felt cleaner than the air inside that house. I had walked into Maplewood Avenue not as a victim, not as a tenant, but as the rightful owner making her final move. And in leaving it, I left behind more than walls. I left behind their illusion. As I reached the car, David opened the door for me. I glanced back one last time. Through the window, I saw Lillian clutching her phone, her lips moving quickly, her face pale with panic. Dominic slammed a cabinet in the kitchen, his body rigid with rage. They weren't defeated yet. They were desperate, and desperation is more dangerous than arrogance. Resolution of this moment came in finality. The house was gone from all of us, passed to a new family ready to build their story. Transition came in inevitability. Lillian and Dominic had 48 hours to face the truth, but inevitability carries risk, because desperate people don't always face truth quietly. As David started the engine, my heart whispered a question I couldn't silence. Now that the walls are gone, what will they do when they realize the only thing left to cling to is their own ruin? The 48 hours after Karen Grant's verdict were the longest of my life, not because I doubted the outcome but because I could feel the storm gathering behind those brick walls. Lillian and Dominic were cornered animals now, and cornered animals don't sit quietly. They claw, they bite, they thrash until there's nothing left. David didn't leave me alone during those 2 days. He moved like a shadow, making coffee in the mornings, sitting across from me at the table in the evenings, his eyes always scanning my face for cracks. You're steady, he said once, almost as if he couldn't believe it. Most people would be falling apart right now. I smiled faintly. Hospitals taught me something, David. The worst moments, the deaths, the codes, the screaming families, they're not when you fall apart, they're when you hold the line. Falling apart comes later, when you're alone. Right now, I don't have that luxury. He nodded, his respect silent but present. Mariah came to visit each afternoon, slipping away from Maplewood, as though the house itself couldn't hold her anymore. She sat with me on the couch, doing her homework while I folded laundry or sorted through paperwork for the trust I had begun to plan. She didn't ask about the house, she didn't need to. Children see the truth without it being explained. She knew her parents' empire was collapsing, and she knew I was the one holding steady while the walls gave way. On the second evening, David returned from Maplewood with news. His expression was grim, his voice clipped. They're not leaving, Ma. They're pretending like nothing happened, boxes untouched. Dominic was pacing the driveway when I drove past, shouting into his phone. Lillian looked wild. I didn't flinch. They'll leave. The sheriff won't give them a choice. He hesitated, then sat down heavily. I don't like the way he looked at me, Ma. There was something dangerous in him. I knew what he meant. Arrogance can be loud, but desperation is louder. And Dominic wasn't a man who knew how to lose. That night, I lay awake on David's couch, Harold's watch ticking faintly on the table beside me. My mind wandered through the house one last time, the creak of the stairs, the smell of Harold's sweat in the summer, the sound of Mariah's laughter bouncing off the walls. It wasn't grief that filled me, it was resolve. Maplewood Avenue was gone, but dignity remained. The next morning, Karen called. "The Jeffersons want to do a walkthrough today," she said briskly. "They'll be moving furniture in this weekend." "Will the sheriff be there?" I asked. "I've already coordinated," she replied. "If the Welleses refuse to leave, an officer will accompany us. It won't take long." At noon, David drove me back. Karen was waiting with the Jeffersons in the driveway, a sheriff's cruiser parked discreetly at the curb. The officer leaned casually against the car, but his presence was undeniable. This wasn't a request anymore, it was an order. When we approached the porch, the door slammed open. Dominic burst out, his face flushed, his shirt untucked. He pointed at me, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you've won? You think you can just walk back in here and erase us?" I didn't move. "I didn't erase you, Dominic. You did that yourself." Lillian appeared behind him, her face pale, her eyes frantic. She clutched her phone in one hand as if it were a weapon. "Mama, please, don't do this. We'll have nothing." The sheriff stepped forward, calm but firm. "Ma'am, sir, you have until midnight to vacate the premises. Failure to do so will result in forced removal." The words landed like a hammer. Dominic's mouth twisted. He looked like a man ready to swing his fists, but the sheriff's steady gaze pinned him. Slowly, he stepped back, muttering curses under his breath. Inside, the Jeffersons walked the rooms quietly, Karen at their side. David stood close to me, his presence solid, while I let my eyes wander over the walls one last time. For a moment, I could almost see Harold leaning in the doorway, his hands calloused, his face soft with pride. As we left, Mariah slipped down the stairs, her eyes red from crying. She ran to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "Grandma," she whispered, "are you leaving for good?" I knelt, smoothing her hair. "I'm not leaving you, baby. Remember that. I'll always be here, even if I'm not in that house." Her little hands clutched mine, desperate. "Promise?" "Promise," I whispered. David guided me out, the sun blazing overhead, the sheriff's presence heavy in the air. The Welleses stood in the doorway, broken shadows of themselves. Resolution came in the clarity of finality. The law had spoken, the papers were signed, the Jeffersons were preparing to move in. Transition came in the unease that lingered. Dominic's eyes, sharp and wild, burning into me as though he were planning something I could not yet name. That night, back at David's apartment, the silence was heavier than usual. He sat across from me, his hands steepled, his brow furrowed. "They're not going to let this go quietly, Ma." I looked down at Harold's watch, the ticking steady against my palm. "I know." Mariah's words echoed in my ears. "Promise." And as I sat there, the weight of freedom pressed against the weight of danger, I couldn't help but wonder, now that they had lost the house, what would they do to strike back at me? The sheriff's cruiser rolled away at dusk, its red and blue lights fading into the haze of the Houston evening. The Welleses stood on the curb with their boxes, their voices sharp and hollow, while the Jeffersons watched from the porch of their new home, polite but firm in their claim. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift from my chest. Maplewood Avenue no longer belonged to me, but neither did it belong to those who had tried to strip me of everything. The story had closed on that house, but not on us. David drove me back to his apartment, his face set in silence. Mariah sat in the back seat, clutching her teddy bear to her chest, her eyes wide as she looked out the window. She didn't speak until we reached the city lights. "Grandma," she whispered, "where will Mama and Daddy go now?" I glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "I don't know, baby. That's for them to decide." But even as I said it, a part of me knew. People like Lillian and Dominic didn't plan for tomorrow. They lived in illusions until the walls caved in. And now, with no walls left, their desperation was a storm waiting to break. That night, David cooked dinner fried chicken again, the same comfort he always turned to when the world felt heavy. We ate quietly. Mariah perched at the table between us, swinging her small legs as though trying to pretend this was normal. But the silence between bites carried a different weight, and I could feel David watching me. "You're steady," he said again, repeating the words he'd spoken days earlier. "But I know you, Ma. You're thinking 3 steps ahead. What's next?" I looked at him, my son who had seen war and returned with scars he rarely spoke of, my son who had stood at my side when everyone else had turned against me. "What's next?" I said slowly, "is making sure Mariah has what she needs. A future, a chance to break the cycle her parents are trapped in." He frowned. "You mean money?" "Yes," I said, placing Harold's watch on the table beside me. "The house brought in $850,000. I've already spoken with Karen about setting up a trust, not for Lillian, not for Dominic, for Mariah." Mariah looked up from her plate, confused. "What's a trust?" "It's a promise," I said softly, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "A way to make sure you'll be okay when you're older. For college, for a home, for freedom. It's my way of making sure you never feel powerless, no matter what happens." Her small fingers curled around mine. "Like Grandpa's promise about the house?" I swallowed hard. "Exactly like that." David leaned back, his eyes shadowed. "You're cutting Lillian out completely." "Yes. And you're all right with that?" I met his gaze, steady. "She cut herself out when she forged my name, when she pushed me out of my own house at 2 in the morning. Actions have consequences, David. She chose hers." He didn't argue, but I saw the question flicker in his eyes, the same question that would stir in others. Was I right to close the door so firmly? Was there room for mercy and justice? Or would mercy only have invited more betrayal? The next morning, I met with Karen again. We sat in her office, the papers spread neatly before us. She spoke quickly, explaining percentages, interest rates, long-term protection. But all I heard was Harold's voice, steady and quiet. "This house will carry us." By the time I signed the final document, the money had transformed into something more than numbers. It had become a new foundation, not of bricks and mortar, but of dignity and legacy. I slid Harold's watch on top of the papers, whispering, "We did it, Harold. We kept our promise." Word of the sale spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors called, some shocked, some curious, a few quietly supportive. But it was Mariah's visits that mattered most. She came each afternoon, her school bag slung over her shoulder, her smile a little steadier now. Sometimes she brought drawings of houses she imagined, colorful and messy, filled with laughter. "This is where I'll live someday," she said, placing one in my lap. I studied the crooked lines, the bright windows, the flowers blooming in front. "It's beautiful," I told her. And it was, because it wasn't about perfection, it was about freedom. But not everyone saw it that way. 2 weeks later, David opened the front door to find Lillian standing there. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes red from crying. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, like a child lost in her own storm. "Can I talk to Mama?" she asked, her voice hoarse. David hesitated, but I stepped forward. "Let her in." She entered slowly, glancing around the apartment as though she couldn't believe I had traded Maplewood's 2 stories for this modest space. She sat at the table, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking, "why did you do it? Why did you sell the house?" I studied her, my daughter who had once clung to my skirts, who had once begged for new dresses, who had once looked at me with eyes full of want. "Because it was mine to sell," I said quietly. "Because you forgot whose name was written on the deed." She shook her head, tears spilling. "We were drowning, Mama. We needed help. You could have saved us." "I already did," I said, my voice steady. "For 40 years, I saved you. Every dollar I earned, every night I spent in that hospital, every bill I paid, that was me saving you, and you repaid me with betrayal." Her face crumpled, but her words sharpened. "And Mariah? You're just going to cut me out and give her everything? What about me?" David's hand slammed against the table. "What about you, Lillian? You forged our mother's name. You stole from her. You threw her out like she was nothing. What makes you think you deserve anything now?" She flinched at his fury, but her eyes returned to me, pleading. "Mama, I'm still your daughter. I felt the weight of the room press in on me. This was the question that would linger, the one that could divide even strangers who heard our story. Was blood enough to demand forgiveness? Or had she crossed the line so completely that forgiveness itself became a lie? I reached for Harold's watch, my fingers brushing its worn surface. You're my daughter, I said softly, and that will never change. But being my daughter doesn't give you the right to take what isn't yours. It doesn't erase what you did. She sobbed, her head dropping into her hands. Mariah, who had been silent in the corner, suddenly spoke. Her voice was small, but it cut through the room. Mama, Grandma kept her promise. You broke yours. Lillian's sobs grew harsher. She rose abruptly, grabbing her purse, and fled the apartment. The door slammed behind her, leaving the silence heavy, trembling. I sat there, Harold's watch ticking in my hand, my heart steady but heavy. Resolution came in the finality of choice. The house was gone, the trust was set, the legacy secured. Transition came in the uncertainty left behind. The fracture with Lillian had deepened, and whether it would ever heal was a question no paper could answer. As night fell, I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Mariah curled beside me, her small head resting against my shoulder. Grandma, she whispered, will Mama ever forgive you? I closed my eyes, the question echoing like thunder. Or will I ever forgive her? And in that silence, I realized the truth. The battle for dignity was over, but the war for love, messy, painful, endless, was only beginning.